everybody who's in here, Ethan, did you submit the track called 21?
Yes.
Okay, cool. That's what I thought. Did any? Oh, here's Justin. So Justin's the track I just sent you, Nathan.
Okay.
Anybody else in the meeting right now that? That's what I thought. Did any? Oh, here's Justin. Oh, sorry, I'm getting some doubling from the YouTube. Is there anybody else in here that's wants to play something?
I do. Should I send an MP3 or an AIF file?
Whatever is easiest for you.
Yep.
Okay, cool. And send it to hello?
Yeah, that works.
Great.
So whose track is Guitar 2.1?
That was me. So save that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Got Michael's track, so I'll send that over.
Okay.
And why don't you give yourself a little bit of a background, Nathan?
Sure.
Just for people who might not be aware of what you have done and what you do at school and all that.
Yeah, so I was born in, no, I'm just kidding. So I'm from Colorado originally. I grew up on the piano. Suzuki method was my means of approaching that for the majority of my life. I moved to New York when I was 18 and went to Dubspot, if any of you guys are familiar with that. I had picked up music production on my own with FL Studio, years previous to that. And so I had done a lot of, self-teaching there, and then eventually wanted to get a job at Dubspot. Dubspot fell apart, not going to tell that story, and thus I entered the larger music industry and jumped through a bunch of different things. Went on a few different tours with a couple of different people, between being not successful at all and being quite successful. I've done a lot of different client work, from producing for vocalists and other producers, doing engineering work, more lately doing more corporate stuff, so producing for commercials, doing jingles for companies when they release new products, stuff like this. So I've definitely jumped around a lot of the different aspects of the music industry in the past decade. I logged my 10,000 hours with production pretty early. And so I might look young. I am a little young. I'm 24. But yeah, so if you guys have any questions beyond after we cover these tracks, obviously we're here for quite a while. Like, we're going to talk for a bit about our tracks, but if we have any extra time and you guys want to jump into anything, maybe not necessarily so Ableton or production focused, I'm more than happy to answer any questions if you have, any curiosities about the process of releasing your music when it comes to publishing, et cetera, I could get one. So that's going to be up to you guys. And that's me. My project is Icarus Moth. If you're familiar, if you want to look that up on Spotify, is probably the best place to do that. I just released a website that my lovely manager helped create for me. It's icarusmoth.com, so you can get kind of an idea of the project there. And some of the other clients I've worked with as well. Okay, so let me see. I have... Sorry, everything runs really slow when you're on Zoom. I have not received that other track, Thomas.
Okay, it should be coming in.
I have 3 in total.
There's Justin. So yeah, the one that should just be coming now is going to be Michael's track, Land of Wolves. And then anybody else? We had somebody briefly.
There we go.
Cool.
Okay, so do I want to jump in, or should we wait a little longer? What's the move?
I think it's fair to jump right in if everybody's ready. I usually keep an eye on the time. We don't have as many submissions, but we'll probably give it like 15, maybe 20 minutes per track. Limit it to that, and then I'll keep an eye on that. So I'll just give you kind of a 5-minute warning.
Gotcha. I'm not going to pay attention to that at all, so
Yep.
you have to help me with that one.
Right,
Anyone? Did you guys want me to pick? Or anyone want to go first? Anything in particular? Crickets. Okay, I got you. We're gonna start with 21 here because it's what I've got already pulled up. So I have all of these brought into Ableton. I haven't messed with the levels at all. I'll fix this. I do have a limiter on my master, not increasing the volume at all. It's just there to make sure if there's any clipping that we don't have that through Zoom. So we'll play it back and then we'll chat about it. Wrong button. Nice. Very cool. Mm-hmm. So we could all hear that, right? Was the audio quality? How are we doing with that?
Yeah, it's a little glitchy, but it's okay.
Okay, cool. So I don't know, Thomas, if you've had ways around dealing with that in the past. But I did have the chance to listen to this one on my monitors out of my headphones, and when I play the other ones back, I'll be able to do the same thing and mute my mic. So I'll be listening on like my full system. But yeah, I think this is very cool. I want to note a few things that I think are really well done first. The drums, like what genre would you call this track?
Well, I said IDM when I was putting it out. My story is I'm a film composer.
Cool.
This was right when Massive X came out. This Native Instruments was really pushing that synth, and this was done for a Metapop competition. Sort of the funny part of that competition was that the synth is so heavy on the CPU and GPU that everything else had to be analog, because I could only run one sound out of my computer.
Right. Yeah. That can definitely get in the way when it comes to some of the Native Instruments stuff, for sure.
Yeah. So the beat is 10 plus 11. That's why it's called 21.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I was wondering there.
Yeah.
So I mean, IDM definitely makes sense to me. That feels right at home, especially with what I was going to mention about the drums, which they are they follow the pulse really well, right? So they keep you following this very consistent rhythm. However, they're not constantly doing the same thing over and over and over again, which is very akin to like IDM stuff, where you have a lot of unique drum hits and fills, kind of filling the space every now and then to help keep it spacey, but also not too repetitive, right? So I thought that was really well done. Where I marked this section here when I accidentally skipped back in the track a little bit, where we have some effects going here, I want to note as well, because the way you have done stuff in your stereo field is very cool. So the sounds that you have that are right down the center, very mono, how they contrast what happens when you throw stuff wide into the stereo field, is really nice. There's a really nice contrast there, and I'll play back this spot where it's really well defined. So we can hear how the drums are nice and steady in the middle, and then when you throw it into that nice ping pong delay, they bounce around the stereo field. Are we all hearing that left and right? I know Zoom sometimes has
not so much
stuff going on. Okay, so but I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, it was purely on accident, probably. I was like, this sounds good.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like, this is music production, right? If we consider some of the coolest parts of some of our favorite songs, they were all probably happy accidents, or there's a solid chance that a lot of those things were happy accidents. Part of what makes being a producer so, alluring is we get to experiment around with this, sound design stuff that can lead us down these pathways that we never expected to go down, and we stumble across some really cool sounds that we would have never really thought of on our own without that process, right? So yeah, I never devalue something for being an accident. If anything, it's cooler that way, because it helps kind of keep that level of mysticism in the production, right? So yeah, I really like the way that you've controlled the stereo field here. I really like the drums for sure. The way that you handle this meter is really cool, because how consistent this rhythm is helps keep the listener, where the drums are and where the rhythm is. But it is also, it's kind of hard to tell where phrases start and end, which is, and again, kind of that cinematic or IDM-esque progression, which I think is really cool and fits the vibe here really well. Arrangement speaking, I think this is really solid, right? We have an intro section and then the main chunk of your track, and then you let it breathe, which gives the listener a chance to kind of like, okay, I don't have to worry about feeling this rhythm anymore. If maybe someone's dancing to it, they can kind of take a break there. And you help the sound design open up in that spot, because we don't have all of this percussive stuff, playing on top of it that can help draw the attention away from some of these cool synths that you've designed with the synthesizer. And then obviously it all kind of swells back into the rhythmic part to help bring it all home. So I think that was all really well done. The biggest bit, I guess, of criticism that I would note is, and I think it's probably the most identifiable at the very end here. Are you familiar with the concept of sidechaining?
Yeah.
Are you sidechaining your bass line to your kick drum here?
Yes.
So I would maybe recommend pushing that sidechain a little bit more. Or maybe we can talk about some cool different compression tricks we can do to the kick drum. Because if I play this section here towards the end, do we kind of notice how not every single bass note reacts with the kick drum as well as some of the other notes?
That's also all the Eurorack stuff starting to fall out of sync by then.
Okay. So for the most part, I don't really talk too much about quantization stuff in feedback sessions, because that's very much a stylistic choice. Like I hear that, I notice the analog, and I think it's cool because it has that analog texture and sound. And a large part of that is things not quite hitting perfectly in time, or not quite being at the perfect tuning ratio. And so that stuff is really cool, and I don't think it's necessarily a problem that you have to overcome like that. I think you could just use a couple of really cool mixing tricks to help move those things out of the way from each other. So even though that's happening, it's not going to have any sort of conflict there.
Yeah, I'm open to anything. I mean, I hear that there's a disturbance in the force there.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first kind of easy thing that you could do would be to increase the power of that sidechain. So I'm maybe wondering how you do your sidechain here. Are you working in Ableton?
No, this was probably done in Logic, but I work in Ableton too, so you can show however you want to show.
Okay, so are you using the Logic compressor to do your sidechaining?
You know what? This was probably done with a dynamic EQ sidechained to the low end of the kick drum.
Okay, cool. So that might be why it feels like it maybe needs to be a little bit stronger, because when you have those dynamic EQs, especially if they're on like a bell shape or a shelf, they're not cutting stuff quite as strong as they maybe need to. And then you're still letting a lot of those frequencies and harmonics bleed through, which will conflict with the lower frequencies in your kick drum. Because if we're familiar, if we remember, lower frequencies, as far as like the human ear is concerned, we're a lot more sensitive to changes in frequency between them, especially when they're overlapped. Like when we do this with higher end frequencies, we can get some nice soft detuning, kind of like the future based synths and stuff like this. But when it happens in the much lower registers, we create, phase cancellation and some rumble that we don't necessarily want. So that's what we're trying to take care of with either some cool compression tricks or some sidechaining tricks. And so when it comes to Ableton, let me grab a kick drum that maybe emulates the one in this track a little bit. Let's see. My lovely, horribly unorganized samples. I don't want to spend too much time on this, so you know what? We're going to use that. And we're going to shorten it a little bit. Okay. So this could be like the bass sound, right? It's not too far off from what we've got going on here. Okay. So what I may recommend doing with this compressor is, if I pull up the Ableton one real quick. Sorry, I got to move the zoom stuff all the time. Have we used the Ableton compressor to do sidechaining ever?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we're familiar with the little drop-down caret that allows us to see the sidechain window. There's a few different ways that we can use this, and the quicker way would be to immediately just connect this to your kick drum and attach it to the bass sound, and tweak some of these settings to have a more absolute, cut for the sidechain. And then if it's too strong, we can always use this dry wet to reduce the effect there. However, there's a neat trick that I like to use, which I'm worried may push into this 15-minute window I'm supposed to be dealing with. But if you create a little click with any synth you're familiar with, the less CPU power, obviously, the better. So if you like Operator, all you really have to do is reduce the ADSR of these things so that it doesn't exist, really, right? We're trying to just kind of kill the sound, reduce the frequency of the cutoff down to 30 hertz. So this has just been kind of heavily neutered down to a very short little blip. And I can kind of prove that. If I hit a note, you can see it reacting in the meter, but no one's hearing anything. It's a very short sound. If you layer every single kick drum in your song with this guy and use this as your sidechain trigger, what that allows you to do is the release, the attack, and the ratio adjustments of your sidechain they take way more control over the shape and the response of your sidechain. Because if you're actually sending a kick drum into there, it's going to be dependent on the shape of your kick drum as far as the amplitude being sent to the input signal. And so if you use what we call a sidechain click, that can kind of help you shape the sidechain a lot more to your liking, whereas you're not dealing with the shape of your kick drum at the same time. in which case we don't even need to bother with like the EQ section of this sidechain to target the part of the kick drum we need to make a snappy sidechain, stuff like this. And particularly this release knob takes control of, you know, how snappy this is. So if we wanted a sidechain that's not really audible but still there in a mixing sense, we could hover this around like 20 to 30 milliseconds, and our ear shouldn't really notice the lack of audio there because it's swooping up so quickly. And so all we'd have to do is select our operator, and then we can see when I adjust this a little bit. So you do have to kind of tweak the compressor a different way because we're dealing with a much different type of signal. So mainly boosting the gain all the way here, and kind of doing a similar thing with the ratio by cranking it up to max. So it's a very effective, you know, sidechain. And we also lowered the threshold all the way down to capture as much of the signal as we can. We can see now as I adjust this release knob, we have a very like clean response on this sidechain, and we can use this to, you know, take a little bit more control over how our sound is interacting with the kick drum itself. So I might recommend starting there because I think that's going to be the biggest help to that issue there. There's another thing we can do to the kick drum too, which will help it stand out in the mix that has nothing to do with the sidechain and is also pretty simple. First, I could demonstrate it with something a little bit fancier than an EQ. Does this tool pop up? Can we see this window?
No.
Okay, I would have to share my desktop. That's a bit of a bummer. Okay, regardless. So there are tools out there. You might have seen some of them like BX Boom or Little Labs VOG. They're like low-end resonance harmonic saturators is kind of what they'll call themselves, or harmonic excitement, stuff like this. And like a too long didn't read version of what this does is it just adds a low shelf with a high resonance, which means when you attach it to a kick drum, particularly not a cut, we don't want to be using a high pass filter here. We want to be using a shelf, because when we slide the cutoff point of this up on the kick drum, other than the 808 bit of this, do you hear how it kind of sounds like tuning up a drum head of like a real kick drum? It's kind of like you're changing the fundamental pitch of your kick without actually cutting out frequencies. So playing like this section of the track that we're kind of focusing on, where you have the bass and the kick soloed together, and doing this sweep with the EQ until you kind of find the sweet spot as far as in the key that you're using, that could also just provide some similar assistance there. And not only doing this with the kick drum, but also your bass sound as well. But bear in mind that, you know, this is going to change the like respective low end overlapping frequencies. So you'll always want to like A/B these things to make sure that you really do enjoy the change that it's making. This would enable you to maybe pull back the sidechain on the compressor a little bit, so you don't have to max that out as much as maybe what I demonstrated there. I think when you do this, what you'll find, especially with the mastering process, because it does look like you have a maximizer on this of some sorts, is you'll be able to push everything a lot more than you otherwise would be able to. You'll find, I think, if you do this often, that the first thing to go with that maximizer is the kick drum, usually. And a lot of the time that has to do with the side chaining between the kick drum and other elements of your song. Doing these low shelf cuts is pretty handy for your instruments as well, because if any of your instruments have sub or low end information bleeding through in the audio, those things will conflict with your bass and your kick drum too, even if you can't really hear them in the sound, right? So I think a combination of all of these things will really help clean up the relationship between the kick and the bass, and you don't really need to go and do any changing to the sound design at all. And then I think you'll find that your drums will stand out a bit more, and that will kind of balance out the relationship between some of your instruments and your drums as well. And then keep in mind, if you do decide to go this route, like the operator EQ route, with the compressor, which I apparently deleted, you can then copy that onto all of your other instruments and kind of set that release knob to whatever they are, right? So if it's a more tonal, high frequency instrument, it would not nearly need as much side chaining going on because it's not nearly as much in the way of that instrument or that sound or that drum. So those would be my main recommendations there. I think like your sound design, your stereo field control is really solid. I think the composition here is really solid and cool. Did you have any questions, or did you want me to focus on maybe a different aspect of this? Because really the side chaining between the kick and the bass was the only thing that stood out to me as maybe something you might want to go back and look at.
Sure. No, you know, like every other person who writes music, it's sort of like you're in a hole and you never get feedback sometimes. So I'm just open to whatever, you know, whatever you hear first.
Gotcha. I mean, again, with something like this, because, you know, we all write different genres, and I don't want to go poking like around opinion wise. I want to focus strictly on criticism. A lot of it's going to be like sound design, mixing, and arrangement stuff. I think notably your arrangement is really solid for a genre like this. You certainly don't like exhaust any particular part of this track to the point where I feel like you should maybe make it shorter or longer. The sound design around the middle here. Oh, excuse me. Does seem to have quite a peak around, let's see, it's maybe like 800 hertz. Let's find it. Yeah, kind of around 800 hertz or so. And maybe another one a little bit higher. No, not really. It's really just the 800-ish or so, give or take 50, maybe more like 700, give or take 50. There are kind of some natural sections on an EQ that are generally harsh for the human ear. 800 is kind of one of them. 1K can fall victim of being one of them, especially in vocals. 4K is really a huge victim of this, especially in guitar sounds. And so there's a few different ways you could go about this. Adding just a really small dip in your EQ to some of these sounds where that is, I think would help a lot, because it will enable you to either increase the volume of those sounds or actually push your maximizer a little bit more. That's I'm kind of stretching for feedback at this point. Like, it is a really solid track for sure. It's mostly just mixing things. I think doing that low end resonance bump thing that I mentioned on your bass will really help the lower frequencies of that stand out. I think something that maybe everybody in this Zoom call might recognize is when you play notes higher up on the scale with a sub bass, they'll become tubbier and louder, as if they are actually louder than the lower frequencies. Some of that has to do with how our ears absorb sound with sound pressure, but the other bit is that we're all using different things to create music, you know, and the roll-off frequency of our different speaker systems is going to be different. And so, yes, those speakers are pushing those frequencies harder, but they're not actually louder. It's mostly your system. And so doing things like compression will help us deal with that. And so we don't have to worry so much about it sounding different on different systems. But also doing really small cuts like this will also help just deal with that across the board as well, because this is not going to affect a more full frequency system. It's only going to really help out stuff like earbuds or laptop speakers. And bear in mind, if I click on this dip that I made on number 4, look how little I've dragged that away from like the home row, right? And that's 1.3 whole decibels of a reduction. So for those of us who aren't really keeping this in mind, the Ableton EQ is so sensitive. Like, to try and just get a negative 0.5 decibel reduction, it doesn't even look like I've touched this really. So also just be wary. If you're using the EQ, let's try and avoid doing stuff like this unless we really need to and where we know why we're doing this, just because cutting this much of pretty much any of your instruments out is going to be potentially damaging to the way that they come across on other systems, even if it might sound good on yours. Like, something that producers can fall victim to is mixing their song to their system, right? So making it sound good for your speakers only, so that you're adding a bunch of EQ cuts to make sure things sound like as perfect as they can, but then you go and play in your headphones, you're like, whoa, where'd my song go? So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. But I think this is a really great track here.
All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, man.
I have a couple of comments and questions from YouTube really quick.
Oh, yeah, I forgot YouTube Land's alive. What's up, YouTube?
First one, somebody said it sounds like Brian Eno.
I hear that for sure. You're
not sure if you guys are familiar with him.
Yeah,
also,
I'm familiar with him.
Okay, cool. And somebody said Lalo Schriffen, who I guess is a pianist.
Yeah, he wrote the Mission Impossible theme.
Okay.
He's famous for a lot of things in the 60s and 70s, a lot of TV, a lot of movies.
Gotcha. And then one other comment, I guess, for Nathan was just wondering why you positioned your acoustic treatment that way in your room.
Oh no.
Like,
Because the acoustic treatment that I have in my room doesn't do anything at all. So it's because I had it and I didn't want to really toss it. It is having such a small effect on the recordings going on in this room because it's a pretty small studio. You can't really see it. If I tilt this down, maybe you see this trash bag right above my hand right there. That's filled with a material called Roxol, which is like soundproofed insulation. That's doing way more for my room than the Amazon foam is. It's from Amazon. That's part of the problem. But yeah, there's kind of no rhyme or reason to the positioning of these things, and they also fall off all the time, and so that's where they are. To be fair, if you wanted a valuable answer to that question instead of just some nonsense, you should probably try and target problem areas. So stand in different parts of your room, and if things become like super tubby or like extra damp, maybe add some foam there. Problem spots are usually corners, which is why I have my Roxol lining the corners. It's also helping with soundproof for my neighbors. But yeah, you'll find like my corners are all foamed up because it's going to do a small percentage of a help. So There you go. It's the long form answer.
Sweet. I think that will bring us into the next track.
Yeah, nice.
We're really cool with that. Very nice job, Ethan. I like that.
Thank you very much.
So this is Justin's track. Justin, do we have you here? If you're like on chat, that's okay too. But I'm gonna jump into this. what a vibe. Nice.
Cool. Does the mic work now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great.
Good. All right, man. Cool.
Yeah. So what do you think?
I think this is really sweet. I have a bunch of questions. First question, what is the sub bass? Is it you pitching down your guitar?
The sub bass is probably just like a synthesizer. I've been using Wavetable a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. I couldn't tell if it was recorded as well or if it was a synth, because it goes really low down, and something, I don't know if you've messed with this at all, but if you record kind of like a direct input of your guitar and then pitch it down an octave or two, it gets way lower than maybe you can actually make a bass guitar go for the most part in like actual real life. So that could be a cool technique. I think the bass sounds really good in this track particularly. I don't think it ever gets in the way of anything, and it's really low too, which means it's generally harder to make those frequencies stand out. And whatever you've done there with Wavetable is definitely done a good job of doing that. You might have noticed I put one of these Ozone 8 tools on the track. I don't think you guys cannot see this window, correct? When I pull up this device? Okay, I didn't think so.
Nope.
So that's an imager, so it kind of shows me a visual aspect of the stereo field in this song. Because one of the things that I noticed is it's like you've done a lot of panning here on a lot of the different instruments and sounds. Excuse me. And I think it's really cool. One thing I would note maybe is having something sitting in the middle as well to help contrast the stereo elements. Because something that I find that happens a lot when you have a lot of different panning things going on, maybe instruments sitting like statically in one side or panning back and forth or stereo widened, as you have a few things, it can become, the word isn't messy, but a little bit overwhelming. It's almost like my brain doesn't know exactly what instrument to focus on at any given time. And there's a lot of different ways that you can mess with that. Like it could be a mixing thing. Like maybe when a more melodic guitar part slides in, you turn down some of the background elements so that the guitar becomes the main focus, and then like vice versa. When you hand off what you want the listener's attention to be paid there to. I don't really have an imager that I can play this song with, but what I can do is put a utility tool on it and play it in mono. Because when you do have a lot of stereo stuff going on, and I'm wondering, did you check this song in mono by any chance?
No, I did not.
Okay, did you make this in Ableton? That's another question I gotta ask.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So let's play this back in, or some of this back in mono real quick. Nice. Okay, so I think the mix is really holding together still pretty well in mono. Something that can happen quite a bit when you're doing a lot of this panning is when you do finally bring stuff back to mono. And keep in mind, a lot of like performance situations will have us performing our music in mono, so we do always want to make sure that that's okay. But when you have a lot of stereo stuff going on, when you slide it back to mono, some of the overlap there can create problems. And I definitely didn't really hear anything major. I don't know if you noticed anything. I think the biggest thing that we get from the mono switch, and I'll play it back and I'll turn it on and off, is that snare, that kind of like rhythmic snare, keeping track of the beat, becomes a lot louder. Let's see. Do we hear that?
Yeah, it does sound a bit louder.
Because if you guys are hearing this in mono, then I don't even know if that would make much of a change. But the reason for that is because your instruments are really, really present in the stereo field. And there's another way that I could demonstrate this too with an EQ. You guys should be kind of taking note of some of these like mixing techniques as far as how to check your track with Ableton. If we switch this to mid-side mode, which means that when we're on M, we're messing with the mono signal, and when we're on S, we're messing with the stereo signal, I can actually take a cut and get rid of the mono signal pretty much entirely and play this back, and all I'm hearing is the stereo field. Hello? Oh, I'm in mono, my fault. So do we notice how all we hear are instruments and we don't really hear any drums at all?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's partly because all of the instruments are pretty much in stereo, and all of the drums, even though they may or may not be like panned a direction sometimes, are a mono signal. And so I think helping balance the stereo field between the drums and the instruments would really help the listener hear all of the different parts kind of on top of each other. Because your mix here is really quite nice. Like I can hear all the different elements that you've added to this song. Like nothing is really getting in the way of any other sounds. It's more of a stereo field thing, I think, because there's so much going on in each side. It can become a little bit overwhelming as far as which instrument my brain wants to pay attention to. The rhythm and the mixing in the snare when we're listening to it in stereo is really solid because it helps keep that kind of rhythm in the background without getting too in the way of this like really nice melodic stuff you have going on with your guitar. But if you were to play this live, I think you would find that snare gets like, really heavy, maybe in an unnecessary way. And so there's a few different ways you could go about messing with some of this stuff. Do you like you I assume you went into a lot of these tracks and intentionally panned these and or added stereo wideness, correct?
Yeah, I was using a stereo widener. I think it was the Ozone one actually. So my question about that was is that the same as if you would pan it individually to the left and the right, like double track it?
Yeah, no.
Is
so
it just doing that as a mirror?
it's kind of similar. So if you the way that you made this wide is by putting is your Ozone imager on individual tracks or is it just on your master and kind of pushing things?
Individual tracks.
Okay, so that is better for sure. And there's nothing wrong with using the Ozone imager on like stereoize mode to increase the stereo width of your tracks. That's a really good way to do it, especially since it's broken into multiband mode, which means you can reduce the amount of stereo width being applied to your lower frequencies, which is ideal for mixing. I'm not sure if you were doing that, but that would be a good move.
Yeah,
but
that's a good tip.
Yeah, but what you might find also is that when you stereo widen things, especially in the mid range, they're going to come out way different in mono than they do in stereo. And that's why a lot of these instruments kind of got sucked down when we switched to mono and the drums became so loud. Particularly what is happening when we make something wide in the stereo, and I'll kind of do a manual demonstration of this with a kick drum. Again, I don't even know if this is streaming in stereo entirely, but we're going to assume. Come on, give me a kick drum. Okay, so we have this little guy here. So if we're imagining what stereo widening to something does is right now here, I'll put a utility tool on this because we see how there's two versions of the waveform here. That means we're looking at a stereo wave file. And so if I put a utility tool on this, put it in mono and flatten it, it will ensure that the sample we're looking at is mono, even though it's still going to show a stereo display. So now what we do when we stereo widen something, you can almost imagine it like we have two versions of the audio, one of which is panned all the way to the left, one of which is panned all the way to the right. And then the reason why all these like stereo widener things have a direction you can choose is because it's wondering whether or not you want to shift forward the right signal or the left signal. And the reason why that's important is because one of these signals is going to become more present, even though it's not louder than the other one in any way. They're at the same level. Because it's playing at a different time, your ears are going to focus on one of the sides more than the other. And so it will sound heavier in one side of the stereo field. So let's see if I can actually demonstrate this. So when they're on top of each other perfectly, as I think they are now, we don't get any sort of stereo field adjustments. So it sounds very normal. However, if I shift one of these forward a little bit, like a fraction of a bit, did anyone notice the stereo change? Are we streaming in stereo? Are we listening?
I'm on my laptop, so I can't really tell.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, but this is essentially what's happening. When you do this shift in time with these two signals panned opposite directions, it throws them way out into the stereo field. However, if I were to go back onto this group now and add a utility tool, which I keep tapping a G, and make it mono again, we have the opportunity for phase cancellation. And if I zoom into this wave shape, you're going to see the closer I get to these kind of curves canceling each other out, kind of like this. So this one goes down while this one goes up. That's giving me the opportunity to, add phase cancellation to our sound, and in which case it's going to get way quieter or way thinner. So I believe what's happening to some of the instruments in your track is that there's a little bit of phase cancellation going on between the frequencies. So when we make it mono, your drums, which are already pretty mono, they get relatively much louder, but your instruments become much quieter. So it's not that your drums are getting louder in mono, it's that your instruments are getting quieter. And that's partly due, in fact, to all of the stereo wideness you have. And so one of the things I mentioned before, instead of turning the volume up and down on the instruments that you want to be kind of front and center with automation at any given point in time, instead increase and decrease the amount of like stereo eyes going on for the ones that you want to be more and less present. So the ones that you want to stand out and be more focused on at that moment would be more stereo wide. So you would have that setting automated up more. And on the other instruments that you don't necessarily want in focus, it would be automated back. That suggestion I made on the other track to roll off the low end on your instruments that are not bass instruments, I think would also help with the volume difference in mono. But particularly because your low end sounds like it's mixed really clean right now, I would maybe just not mess with this unless you feel like you want to. So let me see. Arrangement wise, I think this is really well done. Particularly when you're able to do the transitions between kind of like focal point instruments and the melodic and harmonic stuff in this section, it doesn't feel like it goes for too long in any way, shape, or form, even though it's the large majority of the song. Like we almost are looking at fairly similar arrangements here if I overlap these a little bit. And so that just feels nice. Like it's a natural progression to have this kind of flow of a song, right? This is pretty. It's almost a borrowed from pop structure. I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad for saying that. It's a good thing. But we have like the main chunk of the song first, then we have kind of relief, and then we return to it for a little bit to give everyone what they want again, and then we make them listen to the song again. So we don't keep it going, right? But yeah, so I think this is really well done. Are you side chaining your instruments to your drums as well? It sounded like you were for the most part.
Yeah, I definitely am.
Okay, I wouldn't really maybe mess with that much. You might notice things more when you adjust the stereo field on the instruments, but all of that seems pretty solid to me. Did you have any questions? Anything you wanted me to focus on at all?
I guess I just want to amp up the groove of it, if that makes sense. Like I want to make sure it's got a good rhythm to it.
Okay.
Which I think it's close, but something about it still feels like a little less, I don't know, groovy than I wanted to.
Gotcha. I guess when I think groove, and this is probably more of like an opinion thing than necessarily the best bit of advice, but take it with a grain of salt. When I think groove, I think drums and bass, right? So I would maybe solo your drums and your bass without any of your other instruments going, and if you feel like that's groovy enough, then that's going to be a really great start, right? Because these are the frequencies that make us kind of want to move naturally as human beings. Like this is what we've figured out over time, right? Like we love bass. And with that, we like, low end percussion and all these things. And so that's where I would probably start as far as like picking the song apart to make that, to have that in mind. But I really think it comes down to the mix, and it might get boring for you guys to hear me chirp about that so much during this Zoom call, but producers and everyone else would be very surprised at how different a song feels when the mix is different. Having that stereo field be a little bit less busy will help, different rhythms and different melodies stand out in a way that's going to change the entire feeling of the track. So I would maybe go in and mess with some of those things before I go changing some of the composition or production, because I think it is groovy. I think it's got a lot of really keen rhythms that make me want to move. But with that said, I think it's more of a mix thing necessarily than a composition thing. But if you wanted maybe a note for the production there, I would say maybe just more drums or more rhythmic drums, because that snare that keeps the rhythm consistent is really nice. But there's not much to interact with what the bass is doing rhythmically and genre-wise. That is something that I hear music like this taking advantage of a lot, is having that relationship between the kick drum and the bass be like really, really specific and almost melodic in its own right, if that makes sense. Sorry if I was rambling there. That's more of an opinion bit of criticism than like something that I think goes for anything. But yeah, so take it with a grain of salt. But I really like this song. Again, I'm trying to zoom in on things, so I do have to kind of stretch for criticism here. I didn't expect to be sent such cool music, but yeah, here we are.
No problem. Yeah, I'm only here because I want your criticism. I can keep the compliments.
Yeah, fair. Okay,
Yeah,
so
appreciate it.
To MJD, Land of Wolves, excuse me.
Let's do it.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan.
Copy y'all. Looks like I got those 2 individuals moving. We're trying to get eyes on them right now, see if they're armed. Roger that. Roger. That's your target. Target confirmed. You are clear to engage.
This is the land of wolves now.
Nice. That was really cool.
Thank you.
Yo, the cinematic piano in this intro is very sweet.
Yeah, so that's a remix of a guy, Ryan Tobert, wrote this song Honor, which I believe is in a movie, or I know the guy does scores for movies. So I took that and I tried to remix. Basically, I like that piano, so I tried to remix that, and his song is more slow, and so I tried to remix it into like a dance.
Gotcha.
Song.
So the sounds that you have going on throughout the majority of the song are kind of pulled from this piano. Yes?
Correct. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just chopped it up a bunch of different times so that the beats went quicker throughout the song.
Gotcha. So one thing I hear regarding that, the piano chop. Let me see if I can find like a piano recording here in my samples. I have so much stuff. Come on, Converse. Shoe company. Yeah, okay. Cool. Sorry. Something that you might note when you're chopping up audio, and this is actually even an Ableton. Oh, my Ableton's giving me the angry sound. Okay. And this is even something that might be part of your Ableton settings, but you might notice when you chop something like that, Ableton will add like a fade, right? You can kind of see it. I have to zoom in real far for you to see it. I'm trying not to like miss it. There we go. You see the little fade here?
Yeah.
What that does is it keeps the audio from adding a little click. So you might not hear it. Let me try and pitch this down so it's not really in the way, and I'll shorten it. Okay, do we hear the click? Like, I know I just made this very short, but there we go. We hear the click at the very beginning, right?
Yeah.
And I can even like solo that out to help cut the low end. There we go. We can hear a little click. So that's caused when audio starts without being at like a 0 amplitude, right? So we can see this like wave shape is kind of going up and down, right?
Got it.
If I were to bring this into a sampler, it's a lot kind of easier to see because I can, oops, let me move the zoom stuff as always. I can zoom in and it shows us where that midpoint is, right? That straight line that we can kind of see.
Mm-hmm.
When we move this flag to a point that is on the line, we don't get the click. But if we have it on a spot that has, you know, audio off the line, like with amplitude, then we do get that click. There's a few different ways we can fix that. You don't necessarily need to go through and add fades to all of these pianos.
Yes. So just so that I understand. So when I chopped it up, basically some of those chops, they start not on that line, not on that bass line.
Not on 0, right.
And so there's like a click that you're hearing or
yeah.
that we're hearing. Yeah.
So
Okay. I thought I heard that, but yeah.
There. So
and just to give you a heads up, like a lot of this stuff is new to me. So it's all I'm trying to gather as much as possible.
No disclaimers here.
Yeah.
So yeah. And so there's a few things about that. One, stylistically, especially for the genre of music that this is, might not be something you don't want. Might actually be something you want because it becomes kind of a minimal perk, right? Like if we know the genre minimal, it kind of sounds like some of the percussion used in that genre.
Uh-huh.
And so, you know, there's nothing wrong with using a click like that musically. And since you have delays on some of these piano chops, the click is also being delayed out as if it's a rhythmic tool that you had in there intentionally. And so I was going to ask you if those...
I did notice that when I was making this. I was like... That sound I don't think is supposed to be there, but it sounds kind of cool.
Right. So
yeah.
We've identified happy accidents in all of the tracks that we're listening to. So that's the thing. Like if you wanted to go in and fix that, there's a few different things you could do. You could just turn fades on and actually add a little bit of a fade here to help deal with that.
So that fade, like what you do when you fade that in a little bit, so that gets rid of the click.
Yep. Even just the smallest amount possible, we'll get rid of it. Alternatively, if we were looking at this in sampler, we could actually increase the attack of the sound itself, right? So if I increase the attack, that's no different than adding a fade to it, and it will help catch the click. The attack slider in something like sampler or simpler lets you get a little bit more, like if I wanted to do 0.11 milliseconds from this view, I'd have to zoom in way more. And so sometimes you have to actually increase this more than the minimum value to get rid of the pop. However, it certainly will once you find it. So you basically just want to find the minimum attack value that will reduce that pop if you don't want it, and that will solve the problem for you. So yeah, but again, I'm calling it a problem. It's not a problem. It could be cool. It could be something that once you get rid of, you might decide, hey, no, that actually added some cool like depth to the song. I want to put that back, in which case you can just hit that Control-Z button a bunch of times. But yeah, I think that was the first thing to catch my ears. The reason why I might advocate to cleaning that up is because for no reason other than other producers will know exactly what that is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're going to go through the same kind of thought process I did, which is like, oh, I wonder if that was intentional or accidental. In which case, like, you know, it doesn't matter what we think. So you shouldn't make a decision based on that. But that's kind of like the mindset. You know, it's almost the same reason why, you know, we don't use the same sample that other producers have made super famous or popular because they kind of take ownership of it in type of way, or because it's too recognizable out of a popular sample pack, various things like this.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, that pop, that's the main thing I hear. I'm wondering why we have such amplitude differences between the two sections of the song. Is this particularly the low end instrument that was added to this half, or do we actually have some like automations going on with some of the elements in the song where they become louder?
Yeah, I was just messing around with the volumes at the different levels. I wanted it to be like after the drop to be louder. I'm not sure that I did that correctly, but
no. So there's something to note about that, which is when you actually run the like mixing and mastering process on your track, you do what is called like a final limiter or a maximizer for your song. And when you have dynamic elements like this, and I'll just kind of do this real quick. So I'd go to the louder part of the song. I'd maybe do something like that to increase its general overall volume. If I freeze this and flatten it, we're going to see what this does to the wave shape. So everything has become very, like, consistent, right? If like some of these other checks that have maximizers on, this is looking more akin to that, right?
Yeah. Sorry, how'd you do that?
Well, I'll go right back to that in a second. I used a glue compressor and a limiter, and I'll explain what I did with those tools in a second. But do you notice how this first section of your song that you let be dynamically quieter is showing a larger contrast in dynamics than this section is? This one is, for lack of a better term, more squashed than this is. That's okay. Like if I go and play these two sections. Even though they're not drastically different in volume, this one does get a different sort of intensity to it because of how that process that I ran it through interacts with the different volume levels. So having stuff like that in your track where you're maybe actually just automating the volume of a section up because you want it to be a little bit more powerful totally works because of how this process that we do later functions, right? We're essentially pushing this more than we're pushing this, which means we're preserving more of the like transient information here. We're not pushing the bass as much. And so even though after that process, these things look like they're the same volume and will hit at the same volume, they won't feel like they're at the same volume, right?
Got it.
You've kind of set that up ahead. So what I did here is I grabbed a glue compressor and a limiter. The glue compressor with soft clip on is going to do its darndest to not let things clip above 0. However, you'll notice, I'm trying to do this without murdering our ears. Well, regardless, what I'm trying to say is you can still make it clip. Even though soft clip is on, glue compressor is still capable of redlining, which is why we add that limiter afterwards, because that is a much stronger ceiling. It's called a hard limiter versus a soft compressor.
Right.
And so we're generally doing the majority of our volume increase in the compressor because it's going to do a much better job of preserving the dynamic stuff going on in the song. And so that's going to generally be something that we're intending to do. If I did all of that volume increase with the gain here, we would have heard much less of a difference between this section and this section because it's a lot more of just like a smash everything to the top and then cut it type of deal. And then this threshold, I was targeting like the top of your kick drum. So you'll notice if I really, really lower this threshold a lot and I play your drums, like everything is so smashed down to the exact same volume that there is no volume difference in anything in the song. What I was essentially trying to do is capture your drums, but then push down some of the elements of your song to help your drums stick out.
Got it. Okay.
So what I did was I lowered this down until the dial was hitting somewhere between 5 and 10. And without getting too much into it, because of what the attack and release settings are preset to on this glue compressor, it's going to help the kick and the snare play through the compressor before it pushes everything else down. And then increasing the makeup gain is going to increase the volume of everything together, which will help your drums become a little punchy. And then that final gain boost on the limiter is just kind of to make it as loud as you possibly can without losing quality in the song. That is like the, and I'm sorry how this sounds, but that is like the cheapest way of mastering a song, but it's better than nothing. Like I'm not trying to devalue this because especially like when you're showing a song to a friend, right? You don't want them to have to crank the volume on their system to hear it. And then they go back and play something on Spotify and it destroys their headphones.
Yeah. Right.
So this is kind of like a way to deal with that. I mean, the way that your song is, you can see it's not too quiet. Like it's not like your friend would need to crank their headphones to hear this. However, if the relative headroom of your song looked more like this, which a lot of like jazz and recorded music will come out to be, then I would have to turn up a lot, and then switching back to something like this would be like whoa.
Yeah,
so,
right.
That's part of why we do stuff like that.
Yep, I noticed that as well because I sent it to myself and listened to it in my earpods, but like if I switch back and forth from that to Spotify, I had to change the volume, so that makes sense.
Also, bear in mind Spotify has some crazy like internal limiting stuff going on, so that's not the best reference, but
okay.
So are you familiar with side chaining? Y'all are about to get tired.
No.
Side chaining. Beautiful. So,
learning a little bit about it today, though.
Yeah. So you saw me do this trigger with the operator, but I'm gonna do something a little bit maybe more natural. So I'm gonna grab an audio clip and I'm gonna grab a MIDI clip. One of these things is gonna be a kick drum. Ableton at half speed is great. And that's actually not too far off from the kick drum we got in your track. It's sort of an analog guy. It's too loud and long, so I'm going to, fade it. Hello. It's terrible, but it's okay. Fine. Okay, and we're going to pretend like we have a little drum beat here. And then I'm going to grab, I don't know, a bass or something to do chords. Zoom window. Hello? Did I not solo this? No, I didn't. Okay, that's what we're dealing with here. So the idea here is there's low end in my kick drum and there's low end in my chords, and I want them to interact with each other in a more harmonious way. So we're going to put a compressor onto, and you use Ableton, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, beautiful, beautiful. So we're going to put a regular compressor, not a glue compressor like we did for the master, but a regular one on the synth itself, not actually the drum part, but the synth part. And if we click down one of Ableton's infamous tiny little carrots, that will give us very important information. We gain access to the sidechain panel, which we can turn on, and we're going to tell this to talk to our kick drum here. And so I'm going to find it in the list, right? So this one's called 5 Vengeance Audio Drums, or whatever. Excuse me. And when I play this now, we'll be able to see my kick drum responding in this threshold section here, right? And because this is a drum sample instead of a click we made intentionally, it's going to be pretty loud. So we don't have to really do much to this gain here at all. In fact, what we might want to do is target a specific frequency of this kick drum for the compressor to listen to. The reason for that is if we know what a kick drum is, it's a something that starts with a very high frequency and jumps down to a very low frequency. So if we're targeting a low frequency, then the compressor might actually engage a little bit later than the kick drum plays because it starts at a higher frequency. So we might want to target something closer to the top of its frequency range, which will hit the compressor right when the kick drum starts, which you can see. So I've targeted like 216 hertz. That's probably fine for most kick drums. You can increase the resonance of this shape too, so it's targeting less frequencies in general, which will help maybe the reaction of the threshold be a little bit smoother, which you'll see in a moment. And now if I lower my threshold down, already you're going to hear the synth pulse with my kick drum. I didn't have to do anything else other than that. So that's like the very quick way of kind of hooking that up. Once you do that, your ratio, attack, and release settings are going to be how fast and what in kind of what way does this audio return to full volume. And so generally the way that I organize this is having my ratio be all the way up so that these have more, the attack and the release have more of an effect over the shape of this sidechain. And then I'm going to reduce this attack, but not all the way down to 0, because sometimes, not all the time, when you sidechain things, it'll create a pop or a little click, very similar to the sound that we were talking about at the very beginning of this when you have audio coming off of the like 0 line. And it will basically inject that little click every time the sidechain is triggered. And so increasing this attack is very similar to increasing a fade on a sound or increasing the attack in sampler. So we're helping take care of a click with that. And then this release knob entirely becomes how fast does my sidechain respond to my drum. So if you want it to be what I'll call a mixing sidechain, so something that you don't necessarily actually hear happening, we're going to reduce this down to a much smaller number. So maybe 17 and pull the dry wet back a bit. It's happening, but you don't really hear it, right? If I turn it off, you do still notice it. But you mostly hear it in the kick drum. You notice how we don't really hear the synth changing. We hear the kick drum stand out more.
Yeah.
And we didn't actually do anything at all to the kick drum. It's purely something else that's playing on top of it. And so that would be like a mixing example. If we wanted to use this in a more like melodic sense or a more like genre-based sort of deal, we might max this out a little bit more. And then we get the like normal, like kind of iconic dance pulse to our synths. I think that particularly not necessarily in the intro of the song, but where you have dubbed your kind of like main section could really benefit from sidechain. And it's another one of those things that it's kind of a genre-based thing. So maybe having no sidechain or only like a mixing style sidechain in the intro, and then dropping that more heavier pulsing sidechain for this section will also help those two parts stand out from each other, and give the latter section a little bit more energy, because you'll then have that pulsing synth, which just inherently is more groovy than a sustained sound, right?
Yeah.
So that could be something to mess with for sure. I guess what I would note about what you have here is structurally, it's pretty solid. It's very progressive. It reminds me of progressive music. It very much builds up and keeps building up until it becomes more and more satisfying over time. I would say if it's missing anything, it would be something maybe more melodic. So if we consider like breaking down any song you can think of into like 4.5 parts, we have drums, bass, melody, and harmony, and then like transition effects, but that's the 0.5 we don't necessarily need to include. We definitely have drums, we definitely have bass-ish, and we definitely have harmony because you've got this chord progression going. But we don't have too much in the way of melody. So this would give you the opportunity to, I don't know, record yourself singing, or record a friend singing, or record you playing an instrument. Or if you don't play an instrument, write out like a MIDI melody with some synth you like, or mess around with doing some audio effects on the sounds you have to generate more melodic movement stuff. A tool that could do that for you is something like a psych delay, if you're familiar with that term. Ableton actually does have one, kind of. It's called grain delay. And so if let's see, I'll play like this part. If you change the pitch part to something else, it will actually adjust the pitch. Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. I'm doing this wrong. I hardly ever use this tool, so you're going to have to bear with me here. We're not going to do the sync. Dry wet, we're going to half. Feedback, we're going to go up. There we go. So do we hear how like every delay is an octave higher?
Yeah.
You can use a tool kind of like a psych delay to create a more like melodic thing going on in your sound without actually generating a new instrument for it. And the way to do that would be by kind of maybe painstakingly going through this and making sure that it works well. There we go. We hear that, right?
That's your turn.
Versus. So I don't know, something that helps kind of generate melodies for yourself if you don't necessarily want to do something so like, oh, here's a melodic hook in my song, you know? Because again, it's a genre-based thing. Like this is maybe meant to be kind of atmospheric, and it definitely does the job there. And I think it's really cool for that. If I go back to maybe, oops, excuse me. One thing I might note, it's hard for me. I don't have perfect pitch. I don't know if anyone in this room has perfect pitch. But something that is worth doing is checking your drum sound. So I can tell that some of those are definitely in key and some of them might not be. And so if I go and grab a kick drum, kind of as I've been doing for demonstration. Here we go. Nope. Okay, hopefully this will be good enough. Sometimes this doesn't work super well, and I'll show you the alternative to this. And then just slap the Ableton guitar tuner on there and see if it will pick it up. Sometimes it doesn't, as this one is not. Sometimes you have to increase the volume of it. Yeah, so this one's not actually responding. It should tell you what note is being played here. And so if I get rid of that and now instead put an EQ on here, I can double click in the black space of this EQ to make it bigger. But what that does for me is, if you see when I hover over a section of this EQ with my mouse, in the bottom left hand of this like kind of black space, it's actually displaying a note for me, and it's changing as I slide up the frequency range. So I can find where the main fundamental of this kick is, which would maybe be, right there. And I can see, oh, this is an F, because my mouse is hovering over this fundamental, and you can see in the bottom left it says, well, now it says F sharp. I bumped it. There we go. It says F0, right? So what that's telling me is, okay, this drum is in F. So if you know what key your song is in, it will be pretty obvious whether or not you want an F, because that might just be way out of key and might not work for you. And so in which case, we don't necessarily need to go and find out this information for ourselves. We could just experiment with different pitches on our drums, right? Are you doing drums like this, or are you doing them in drum rack?
I'm doing it like this.
Okay,
yeah, I'm just pulling snares, kicks, and hi-hats.
Yeah, cool. So you can, if you're not familiar, you can just change the pitch of something right here, right?
Yeah.
Are you messing with audio warping and stuff?
No.
Oh, okay. So that would be another instance to kind of up the sound design here, especially since you're using that piano sample. So if I grab a piano sample... Perfect. And I'm actually going to duplicate this so I can play these on top of each other. Oops. Because you'll see why in a moment. So this Ableton audio warping is something that I certainly don't have enough time to get into in full right now. But if you turn it on, which is this button here, you'll be enabled to select from a couple of different audio warping styles. I would suggest messing with like texture, repitch, and Complex Pro for like sound design stuff. But this is going to enable you to actually stretch your audio around and do some kind of crazy warping things to it, right? So if I choose, for example, texture, and then I hit like the halftime or double time button like that, I can adjust these grain sizes. And now it's done some like really interesting things to the audio. I can freeze and flatten this, which is if you know, right clicking on the track, freeze it, right click on it again, flatten it, and we'll turn everything you've just done to a brand new piece of audio. You could also just consolidate it, but if you had actual audio effects on here, it would grab those as well. And then I can halftime this to put it back in, the rhythmic time that it is. Instead of doing texture mode, maybe I'll do complex because I want it to retain its actual sound. And now I'll play the original one and the edited one. It's got a lot more motion. It's got a lot more texture on it. It can just be in general more of an interesting sound to use. And so you can use this warping stuff in a sound design sense, and you can push it really far. So for example, now that I've warped this once, there's nothing to stop me from doing a whole bunch of other warping things to it to change the way it sounds, right? Like maybe we're going to speed it up a lot this time and then do the opposite, right? So there's definitely, it's a rabbit hole. You can do this forever. But we've quickly turned this piano into something brand new. And then if you're familiar with like this sampler tool, and this is maybe something you could do with the piano chop you're already using, instead of designing something new necessarily for the song. It's in your instruments, so it's one of the actual like plugin tools in Ableton. We can drag this warped audio we've created right into the sampler and play it like an instrument. So I can play different notes with it now. And it can push us to doing something a little bit more, melodic maybe. And so after maybe a couple of tweaks with the sound, just to make sure that it is what we want it to be. Do you hear that click?
Yep.
Because I didn't add an attack. See how that'll clear that up for me real quick? So same thing for that piano sound. But we started with this, right? Like this was the original sound. And in very no time at all, we have control of it in a very different sense, right? Kind of a cool bass. So yeah, that's what I would experiment with maybe, because you do have this really nice piano chop that you're already messing with like that. And so maybe pushing some of that like audio warping and other stuff a little bit more than you are now could be a really cool way to incorporate either some more textures on top that help kind of capture the listener's attention, or maybe something a little bit more melodic to help capture the listener's attention. I don't know how you feel about it, but particularly I hear that a vocal could certainly fit in this track. Like it's doing something consistent enough in the chord progression that a vocal could latch onto and write a story around. And so I wouldn't, close off your mind to that idea if you like it.
Yeah, I put that on my list of things to explore, so cool. That makes sense.
Nice, man. Well, all of these tracks that you guys sent me are really cool. I appreciate you sending them in. Yeah, very good stuff.
Yeah, awesome, Michael. A couple of quick questions that came from YouTube.
Yeah.
One of them was, did Michael sample the original track to create this? Or also another sample-related question was, what's the sample at the beginning, like during the intro? I think it was the voice he was referring to.
Oh, yeah. So I pulled, what did I pull? So the song I just pulled from YouTube. Because I heard it on a YouTube video and I was like, I like that song. So I went into the comments, found out what it was, and pulled that up, pulled the actual original song from YouTube, and I dropped that in. And then the samples are, I just found on YouTube like clips of military people talking on walkie-talkies. And then there's a clip in there from the movie Sicario. Okay. That I dropped in there, and that shows up a couple of times throughout the song.
Nice.
So the panning on the vocals in the intro you did manually, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I think that's really cool. I like that kind of idea where you're creating this kind of fake environment where people are actually, doing things in space, even though it's just panning tricks.
Yeah. Right. Cool. Thank you.
Very cool.
Thanks. Nice. Appreciate it.
For sure. So to be fair, I think everybody could benefit from sidechain. I'm not gonna lie, I 100% expected that to be what I spend a lot of time talking about here, because people, it seems maybe negligible, and it's not, and it's also not the most fun part of producing, so it's not the most common thing for people to do. But let me show you guys something real quick. I'm gonna delete these, and I can bring them back in if we want to hear them again. But for those of us who are using drum rack, maybe, and maybe you could incorporate this if you're using like audio files and arrangement view to do drum rhythms too. But if I open up like a brand new Ableton, it's going to have it's going to have a drum rack in it. And it's going to be called like kick, because I have a few drum racks for my drums. We're going to assume it's like that. And this group is drums. And then I have an operator inside of my drum rack that is doing the little click that I was talking about for the sidechain. So we kind of murder these envelopes, these ADSRs, so that we're hardly getting any of a sound. Again, if I play it, you can see it just barely there. And then I rename this sidechain. And so I've got that there. It's all done for me. And then I also have a MIDI track with the compressor on it. That's all hooked up already with all of the different things that I need, right? So it's kick, and then I choose sidechain pre-effects. Okay, so here's something I didn't actually talk about when doing this with my kind of version. When you're using a click and you're layering every single one of your kick drums with this click, you don't want to hear the click. So you want to mute the click because you won't actually hear it in the song like this. However, on the compressor that's pulling your sidechain, you do need to choose pre-effects. If we do post or post-mixer, we're going to do it post-mute and it won't actually hear the audio. So I grab that, I crank my gain, and then I save this. So if I go into the Ableton settings, which I unfortunately don't think you can see unless I share my desktop. So let me actually re-share my screen real quick here, because this is important. Here we go. We can see this, right? So if I open my Ableton settings, we can see these?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Whoa. And if we go to if we go to file folder, at the very top, you see save current set as default. If you hit that, anything you have set up in your Ableton project will be what Ableton starts with when you load up a brand new project. And so I have a sidechain pre-made for me every time I make a new song. So I don't have to bother, creating this sidechain link every single time I start something new. And I do actually have this Ableton project saved, so I can just do this, file new, save. And we can see it's also loading a bunch of other stuff. we can see I have my drums folder with my kick drum rack, my snare drum rack, hi-hat drum rack, perks drum rack, and then some random audio track that I may or may not want to use. Inside of kick drum is my sidechain that's muted, and then this audio track has my compressor that's completely linked up already. So if I add a sidechain, I didn't need to do anything at all. We're already rocking. So it's kind of nice to kind of build that into Ableton so you never need to think of it ever again. And I highly recommend doing that. Thomas will, or I will, post my email in the chat here. So if you guys need like a recap, or you want me to kind of write down in a more explained way how I do my sidechain and how you might want to do that, I can do that. I can also send you an Ableton 10 file that is my startup file, or I can simplify it down and send it to you, and you can use that as well if you'd like. So I don't mind sending you guys an Ableton project file that is my sidechain for you to mess around with. And yeah, there you go. Icarus Moth at 343labs.com is in the description now. So you can send that to me, or sorry, in the chat now. So you can send that to me if you.
How come you do different drum racks for every, like, different parts of the drums?
Because I do my mixing and mastering kind of in the project. I don't like bouncing myself stems, which makes me, it's a lot easier for me to treat those groups of individual samples like stems. Drum rack is really good at the way it does chains and grouping stuff and like its own personal sends and returns. But for as small as this window is to deal with all of that stuff in, I prefer to just do it in the Ableton track, like with all my main tracks, just because of how I like looking at Ableton. So I generally, when I'm in drum rack, I don't have any of that stuff up. It's just this. I don't have to deal with any of the internal drum rack routing or any of that stuff. So that's generally the way I do it. It's also just the way I've always done it, so it's habit now at this point.
You go from start to finish of a whole track, mixed and mastered in one project.
A lot of the time, yeah. Not every time. Sometimes my CPU is too angry at me to actually make that possible, right? But yeah, oftentimes, you know, especially all of us, you know, as we make more and more music, we're engineers already. We are mixing along the way as we produce music all the time. Anytime you're adjusting the stereo field or balance of something, or EQing something in a small way, or adding a tiny bit of reverb or something, you're not just sound designing it and producing it, you're also mixing it. And so we do a lot of this stuff on the way anyway, and then it really just comes to finalizing it with a mastering process and making sure that, you know, your song sounds as good as you want it to on all these different ways that we listen to things, like your laptop speakers, your headphones, your big speakers, your car system, your crappy little alarm clock, you know, all these various things will give us a good insight as to how far along the mixing and mastering process we already are, in which case we could be like, yeah, I don't need to hire an engineer for this. I'll just master it.
Gotcha. Perfect.
Yeah, I find that the lines between production, sound design, and mixing mastering are blurring more and more and more as these tools come out, you know. Like, how many of these synthesizers these days have all this like EQing built into them, dynamic compression built into them? Like, Serum has an entire like effects list board, right? FM8 has an entire effects board. So all of these like mixing tools are built into sound design these days. It's not very hard to see that this stuff is kind of merging into one practice. So that's why.
Cool.
So does anybody have any questions for me regarding the stuff that we talked about? Any Ableton stuff?
I have a question. Do you guys do this every week?
That's
right now we are doing it every week. We have a different instructor that will join us every week. So Nathan is one of our instructors at the school. And next week we'll have somebody else. I don't think it's quite been confirmed yet, but they're all great, you know, and they're all very knowledgeable about different genres. So
yeah, play the same thing. You'll get a totally different response for sure.
Yep.
Cool. Exactly. I gotta hop, but I appreciate you guys taking a look. And
of course.
It was awesome.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
All right, cool. Catch you guys later.
Yep.
All right, thanks very much. I'm had to turn off my video because I've got 2 little kids.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, did you have any questions, man, regarding anything at all? It doesn't need to be music related.
Oh, no, that was very helpful. You know, I've never thought about using just a click as the trigger for the sidechain. So that opens up some creative options too for the attack and release that, you know, some more sound designy types of things.
It can be really solid for sure. And I mean, it's crazy. People don't regard different a song will be when you go through and turn off all of your side chains and on every one of your tracks and you play it back. It's like, wow, I can't even hear anything. And then you go back and turn all your side chains on and you don't really hear anything happening. It's just all of a sudden everything breathes now. So yeah, it seems, like I said, it seems like such a small, insignificant thing to do, but it's so valuable. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, man, anytime.
All right, you two take care.
Yeah, you as well, man.
I'm gonna take care of the screaming 2-year-old.
Good luck, my friend. Have a good rest of your quarantine.
You too.
All right, dude.
Word.
I'm probably gonna stop the stream.
Okay, yeah, that's cool.